When I think about ASP.NET Core, one of the key features I think about is the changes that came in around views and view engines. And when I think about razors, I think about Gillette. But then I think about Andrew Nurse, and I would love to talk to him a little bit about Razor. And he's here.
Andrew Stanton-Nurse, welcome. You are joining us today from Seattle, I assume.
Yep.
Yes, but you're originally Canadian, so we've got one of us down there representing the northern 30 million up here. So welcome.
I grew up in Vancouver, well, the suburbs of Vancouver, and yeah, so I came here out of college. It was an interesting transition, interesting change.
You did two internships with Microsoft before moving down there, right?
Yeah. So I went to school at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, BC, and
Fabulously named school.
It's great. Yep. It's up on the top of a mountain, basically. It's great when there was clouds. When it was a cloudy day, which, it's Vancouver. There were lots of cloudy days. You were up there and you couldn't see the city below. It was really kind of cool.
That's where they film like all the sci-fi shows too,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, because I mean, it's like at the time I guess it's more like 60 years old now, but it was like a 40-year-old university, which is actually pretty modern. And so it had all that like modern concrete structures that were pretty cool. We walk by a place and be like, oh yeah, that was like a headquarters in Agent Cody Banks or something. It's like, cool.
That was in Stargate.
Yeah. And yeah, the opening scenes of Battlestar Galactica are right in the like academic quadrangle, the like main like area everyone congregates. But yeah, I went to a Microsoft career fair and talked to the person. I've been a Microsoft person for a while already. I kind of played around in that space, and I was like, it would be a dream to go work there. And did a little interview there. They flew me down to Redmond. They flew me to Seattle, which is a weird like 45-minute flight from Vancouver, but I wasn't going to complain. And I got to do 2 internships at Microsoft, and then came down full time. It was really fun.
That's really cool. And in one of those, you started working on the Razor view engine, correct?
Actually, I didn't work on Razor during my internships. In my first internship, I was on the I don't know if anyone remembers the Visual Studio Team Edition for Database Professionals product. It was like a database SKU of Visual Studio.
I think both users were down. No,
it was a great team. It was a great product. It was really fun. But I had been an ASP.NET user already. And I was like, hey, I sort of emailed my recruiter. I was like, hey, it would be super cool if I could come back on the ASP.NET team. They were really helpful, and I got an interview for my second internship there. And I came back on the ASP.NET team working on MVC. At the time, Razor wasn't around yet. It was about a year or so before then.
Because you've been there, like you were there before you moved over, and we'll talk about GitHub later, but you were there for like 10 years, right? So
yeah,
I guess that would predate. It'd be MVC. Yeah.
Yeah. So my internship on ASP.NET was in 2008, I believe. It's been a long time, and so remembering the exact times, but it was around that time. And I worked on MVC. Actually, specifically, I worked on the Ajax helpers. If people remember that, you could go like Ajax.action link, and we'd do magic behind the scenes, like partial rendering and all this weird stuff. It was like update panel, but for MVC. And that was cool. That was fun. And like that's one of the things that I really liked about the Microsoft internships is like I worked on a real product that really shipped. It was a relatively small area of the product. You got to, remember you're dealing with people who are just fresh out of college, but they're really smart people. And I loved that I got the chance to actually work on a real thing. And then I came back full time, and I still kind of remember my first meeting with my manager when I arrived full time. And he was like, so we're building this new thing. It's called Plan 9. Which was the code name we had, based on Plan 9 from Outer Space, the old movie. And there's an operating system named after it. It's a great code name. It's really kind of fun. It would later be released under the product name ASP.NET Web Pages. And so this was the sort of like PHP, like trying to build a thing where instead of having all of the ceremony of a model view controller app, you could still have a lot of the composability and structure of a .NET app, but you could write your code in a page and it would just evaluate. And in order to do that, they were saying, well, the ASPX kind of view markup language with the angle bracket, we called them bumblebees, the open angle % thing, was very clunky. And so they had this idea for this new templating language. And the idea existed before I joined. And there was a prototype written by some young new upstart named David Fowler. There's a prototype of the parser out there. And in the meeting, like my first one-on-one with my manager, he was like, okay, so we have this thing and we want you to build the production version of this, the like real thing, not on my own, obviously, but like we want you to drive that. I think probably because I had maybe foolishly put down that I had compilers experience because I took a class in compilers in college. But it was great. It was a really fun experience to just like be there at the birth of a brand new feature like that.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, definitely you were there earlier on too, because you contributed. Oh no, I guess that would come later. So no, hang on. Sorry, I'm talking all over the place here, but I know that you worked on the DNX team as well, right?
Yeah, and that came later. So like I spent a good chunk of a good like half of my 10 years there working ASPD and done at MVC and Razor, and I moved over to Nuget for a little while, and I worked primarily on Nuget.org, the server side components of Nuget. And then I went back over to ASP.NET right around the time of sort of the late betas of ASP.NET 5, which would later become DNX, which would later become .NET Core. So I wasn't there right at the start. I was off on the Nuget team doing package manager things. But I did sort of come back into that, and that's sort of where I spent the last bit of my time at Microsoft up until about June of this year, working on DNX, which became eventually the ASP.NET Core product.
Yeah, there were a lot of name changes and renames and code names and betas and everything through that period. But actually, that's the time when you moved over from, because you were still on the Nuget team when the betas had already started shipping. And I remember that because we were talking down in Seattle, actually. I got a groovy Nuget shirt from you when I was down there. And that's actually when we started recording the ASP.NET Monsters, was shortly after that. So it was just after that that MVP conference where we started recording the .NET Monsters. So yeah, you've kind of been there in the background. And I was joking before we started talking here that I had a pull request in on the .NET command line, which you were a part of, and I like to joke that 7 million people use my code every day because I've got a commit on that ext that's distributed. But you actually worked in that. What was it like with because you guys faced some interesting stuff, right? You were kind of starting to become more open-faced, like outward-facing, than almost any other team at Microsoft that I'm aware of prior to that. But you're still challenged with, probably a lot of the things, the Microsoft-isms that people, like with deadlines and release dates and beta and version numbers and naming and marketing pressures. What was that like in that period?
I remember, I'm having this memory just now even of like, I remember being in a room in one of the offices back when we had offices and actually could go to those offices. I remember being in someone's office. I can't remember exactly who, one of the managers or PMs on the team. It was probably a Scott. And right as one of the other Scots, I think, was doing a keynote at one of the conferences talking about open source .NET Core, right? Because in the early days, ASP.NET was kind of open source, was getting more open source. We had MVC, we had Nougat was more open source. We had even the early work we did on ASP.NET Core was open source, but it still used this like closed source .NET Core runtime that we just grabbed a binary and like put in there. And I remember being there when someone pushed the public, make public button on GitHub during that. So that I think it might have been Scott Hanselman who was speaking or Scott Hunter, I can't remember, but they were like, and now it's open, .NET Core is open for public, open source contributions. That was a really cool moment. It was a really cool thing to be part of, sort of as you said, probably one of the earliest and largest open source efforts at Microsoft. Not the first. There were a couple things. The like Windows installer XML toolkit that lets you build installers was one of, I think, is sort of historically noted as Microsoft's first open source project. But ASP.NET, did kind of pioneer that space a little bit. for Microsoft. Certainly not for, I mean, there was lots of open source stuff out there, but we were one of the early ones at Microsoft. And it was really interesting, like, as we get more and more down this path, we would have other teams at Microsoft sort of coming to us and being like, so we want to open source something and we don't know how to do it. So can you help us? And it was really cool being in that position of like, yeah, we can help you. We know some of the things that went wrong, some of the things we didn't do right and that we want to learn from. But it was really cool being part of an open product at Microsoft. And like you said, James, like knowing that 7 million people, not only 7 million people use your code, but a lot of them complain about it or like
they're vocal
let you
about
know.
it.
Yeah, they let you know they're using it because they're coming and they're filing bugs. And on my grumpiest days, I'd be like, why are we getting all that? Like, I wish people would just use it right or not like find all of our bugs. But even it's still amazing that I have this kind of direct conduit with my users when I'm building a product like that, and being able to communicate with my customers in a way that is different than a lot of other products, because my customers are developers, they're engineers. Like it also means they tend to have ideas about how we should solve the problems, but it's still a great conversation to have. And the impact is huge.
I know exactly how you feel too, because I wrote an insult generator for Windows Phone on the first SDK, and I had over 100 installs, but I got like 30 reviews. So I had, I know exactly what you mean with that direct conduit.
100 installs is pretty epic for Windows Phone.
Yeah, I did win an award. Microsoft Canada gave it was pretty great.
So then you worked a lot on kind of the Asp.Net stuff, but then you went over to the Nuget side?
Yeah. So I after Razor kind of was in a solid place, I moved over to work on Nuget for a little while. And this was about the time that Nuget was well up and running. We had we were no longer, way back in the early days of Nuget, like the package registry was a Codeplex repository and you just put your packages there. We'd gone past that. We had this OData app that was basically our V2 API that was a sort of gallery that much like you see it today. But at the time we were starting to hit those growing pains already, right? Where it just wasn't scaling very well. And one of the things we had noticed was most of the traffic to Nuget.org is reading, right? Is people downloading packages by far, right? It eclipses anything else. People want to upload their packages, but more importantly, people want to download their packages. And that's huge. You're in the build server, right? Like if Nuget.org goes down, people's builds start failing. So having what we kind of realized was that the original design was very much your kind of classic CRUD app kind of thing, where we had a database, and when you uploaded things, we wrote to the database, and when you wanted to get things, we queried the database. And it turns out querying a database is not trivial, right? Like it takes computation power, it takes like a lot of it's got reliability issues. And so one of the things I did on Nuget.org was I was part of the sort of the team that we were building the V3 API of Nuget, the sort of new one, and it was a very static forward API where we said let's pre-generate everything, right? Like so that when you go to download a package, as much as possible, you are hitting static content sitting on blob storage that takes trivial amounts of compute to just send to you. Because we realized like the number of times this data changes is so small compared to the number of times it's retrieved. And so we would literally, when you uploaded packages, we just, we would insert things into a database, but like nobody would query the database except background workers that would just go in and just like reprocess all of this static data. And it was cool thinking about that new way of building a web app based on, we built the web app, the original Nuget.org, based on the best practices at the time, which was like a lot of these tools that were in Asp.Net. And this kind of helped us realize what it's actually like to build, because we're the .NET team, we don't build a lot of apps, to be honest, right? Like we build frameworks, and you all build the apps, and you tell us why our frameworks aren't suitable, and we try to make them better. But it was a good opportunity to build something that felt more real. and actually give some of that insight. And so I'm really glad a lot of the Nuget stuff has now kind of moved a little further away from .NET in that like it's a big service. It needs a team to manage it. It can't just be people from the .NET team sort of doing that stuff. But I'm really glad that opportunity to sort of build some of that experience in the team.
Yeah, I remember having some significant growing pains kind of
Yeah.
early on there. That it was tricky, and I feel like it was maybe just kind of like an under-resourced group inside of Microsoft, but you definitely got it fixed. I haven't had any Nougat problems in a long time. Now all of my anger is directed at NPM instead.
which now that I'm at GitHub is me again. I don't work on NPM, but
oh, that's good, because I was going to tell you that I consider them to be the most fireable team in software.
Yeah, I mean, well, and this is one of the tough things about package managers in general, right? Like, especially building, like, package management is probably one of the, and dependency management in general is one of the toughest problems in software development, right? So you're building a component to do that. You're building a service as well that is critical to everybody's builds. Like I said, when Nuget goes down, when NPM goes down, people's builds start failing, and people don't like it when their builds start failing. I know I don't like it when my builds start failing. And it would cause, like, you know, we even have weird bootstrapping problems on .NET where when Nuget would go down, Nuget would have trouble building to fix Nuget. Like, I mean, you know, everybody feels that pain. It's so prevalent, right? So it's inevitable that package managers are this kind of controversial space where everybody has strong opinions. Everybody gets things wrong and gets things right, and they like do some mix of that, and it creates like it's really interesting to be part of. I would say it's something I am glad is not part of my day-to-day as much anymore. I did my time and I appreciated the impact it had, but I also kind of tired of the impact it had and was like, I just want to work.
It's kind of like serving tables, right? Like I think everybody should spend a little bit of time serving tables earlier in their career because it gives you a better appreciation of service in general. So
yeah, like I know that, you know, I didn't know anywhere near as much about dependency management as a general problem until I worked on Nuget, and now it's so baked into my head because of that.
Well, it's true because a lot of developers will actually approach it as just something that they interface with at the start of a project, and then at some point when their build fails later on, if they try and upgrade a component, and your interactions are usually like it's pretty janky, right? Like it's I just expect it to work all of the time, and I don't want to have to think about it. That's kind of the so it's not very public facing, right?
Yeah, it's the classic. It's the classic. If you're doing your job right, nobody notices problem, right? And people notice when you do your job wrong.
Going back to those earlier versions of Nuget, I'm actually kind of surprised it stood up as well as it did, given the architecture. Was that just by throwing like massive amounts of compute at it, or?
I mean, we didn't have a lot of compute at it. I think it was. I mean, it was somewhat a testament to the platforms we were building on, right? Like we were an early adopter of Azure. We were on ASP.NET MVC at the time. I think one of the things I do think was fortunate is we did kind of notice the problems early enough, not so early that people didn't encounter the problems when the scaling issues happened, but we had already started on that path when they really started to become more prevalent. So I would say, you know, it was a really great, like we were able to get the thing up and running so quickly because of the tools we had. It held up as well as it did because of the quality of the tools we were building on, but it was kind of this inevitable, like it's gonna fall over if we don't fix it, kind of problem. And it's really interesting, like, because Nuget was sort of born out of this accident anyway, right? So what happened was basically, I think David Fowler and David Ebo, who were architecting this ASP.NET Web Pages product that we were building, that thing called Plan 9 that Razor was invented for, and we're like showing this web UI that was built into the site that you built that was like, oh, and you can like browse this gallery of components and install them, and now you have a different data access layer available, and now you have this and that. And they were demoing this to Scott Guthrie, and Scott Guthrie said, so a package manager, right? You've built a package manager. And they kind of looked at each other. This is somewhat apocryphal. This is what I've heard. They kind of looked at each other and were like, "Oh yeah, I guess we have." And that kind of was how Nuget was born. It wasn't like it was already something the community was talking about, because there was I don't know if people remember the new what was it called? It was like called New or New Pack or something. There was this community package manager out there as well.
Right.
So it wasn't on our minds, but it's interesting how that kind of organic thing grows, and that's kind of how Nuget grew up until around the time when I was starting to work on it, where it was all organic, and that's why it had that kind of like, we pulled things together, we got it working, and relied heavily on what we had on the stability of the platform we were on, instead of building something more like scalability focused. And that's kind of we hit that transition point where we're like, oh, okay, we need to actually focus on this now.
So, and then it's an onwards and upwards thing from Microsoft in June.
Yeah, no, yeah, you mean me? Yeah. I had, I mean, March of 2020 hit, and everybody, Microsoft sent everyone home right away.
Why? What happened in March 2020?
What happened in March 2020? Does anybody know?
I think there might be some
like,
sort of basketball thing.
Madness, yeah, some kind of madness.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar.
It's like 4 years ago now, so
yeah. So 4 years ago in March 2020, and I had already been in this kind of state before then of thinking, man, it's been 10 years here, right? Like I've been building, I'm on a really great team. I loved the team I was on. I loved the products I was. I've always loved Asp.Net, and I've always loved being able to be part of it. But I had spent 10 years mostly building frameworks for other people to go out and build really amazing stuff with. Nuget, I got a little bit of the service side stuff, but Nuget, for all of its popularity, Nuget is actually a fairly small service because of how simple it can be, right? And it tries to keep things fairly simple. So I was building frameworks for other people to go build cool things, and I was like, you know what? I've spent 10 years doing that. That was really fun. I want to go build cool things. Not that Asp.Net wasn't cool, but I wanted to go and build the things that users use directly, instead of shipping once a year, throwing some framework out there and saying, go and build things. So I started looking around a little bit, and I decided to hop on over to GitHub, which is not a very far jump these days from Microsoft, because it's a subsidiary.
Intercompany transfer, kind of.
It's a little. It's not the same as like jumping to another team. Like it is like payroll and benefits, and so like HR gets involved, but it is certainly not as dramatic a shift as, say, going to some completely other company. And and it's got this like different vibe, which is really cool. It was that was what I was looking for, was something that was still kind of, I had the stability of this nice big company behind me, and I wasn't going to go to like a startup that was going to fall apart. But GitHub is dramatically smaller than Microsoft, right? I mean, we're talking about going from 150,000 people to like 1,500 employees, right? Yeah. Which is still a big company, but it's a huge drop off from what I was on before, right? So it was really cool to sort of come over and start building services for people instead of frameworks, to start working in a smaller company experience where I can go to anyone and like understand what they're doing, because it's a lot smaller. Microsoft, I would learn about 80% of what Microsoft did from the same public conferences that everybody else learned about them, right? Like, it's a huge company. We can't know about everything that's going on, but yeah, it was a cool shift. It's been really fun. I did that. So in June, I started at GitHub, and I've been working on, and since coming to GitHub, I've deployed code to production 7 times. I think I looked at it, not a very huge amount. I was still ramping up, still learning, but like the previous year on .NET, I had released like 1 production version of .NET. So it's a different pace, right? And that's kind of what I loved about it, was this ability to sort of get in there and like roll code out to every one of those 40 million users that use GitHub, just like that, right? It's different than the 7 million people who use ASP.NET once a year.
And
so have you caused any outages yet?
I have not. Yes, I am good. I'm good. And like part of that is a testament
that part of the
to,
initiation at GitHub, is you're not really on team until you knock out prod?
Until you knock out. Yeah. No, I have done a few on-call shifts, and they have not been a big deal, and I have not caused any outages yet. I mean, that part of that's a testament to like the systems that are put in place, the tests that are there, the ability to quickly roll back and monitor things. One of the cool things about GitHub, and this is well sort of documented out in the public too, is that we use a system we call chat ops, which is basically if I want to deploy to github.com, I go to the .com ops chat channel and I run commands. And Hubot, our bot, which is a public bot you can get, but we have some extra components we've added to it. I say deploy this PR to production, and it goes and does it. And what's really cool about that is I can also, before I'm ready to deploy, just go to that channel and see everyone else doing it. Right? It's all happening in public. It's not like I'm going to some site with a release pipeline and I can't see like what's going on. No, I'm going to a chat channel where everyone is actively doing this process, and I can just watch how they do it and look back on how they solved problems.
So what sort of stuff are you working on there?
Mostly, so it's not much of a secret that GitHub is a big Ruby on Rails monolith right now. It's been that way since it was born, and to be blunt, it works well, right? It's interesting, people talk about monoliths and the dangers of them. It's really impressive how it works, but it is a monolith, and it is a service that is very important to a lot of users. So a lot of what I'm working on right now is in finding where can we draw the right boundaries to start breaking some things away from that monolith and making it so that more user scenarios can work when certain components are down, right? Right now, a lot of the outage questions are tied together at GitHub. Like if the website's down, you probably can't push your code, you probably can't download packages, you probably can't access the API, right? Like as much as possible, we want to improve that thing. And the team does a really great job of keeping all of those things up and running. But it's still nice, just like any kind of design in this thing, you want to segment things, you want to build your bulkheads and split things apart so that if the website goes down, can it be possible for you to still push and pull your code? And then at least you can, you're not sitting in a coffee shop being like, well, I want to save my code, but I can't because it's down, right? So that's kind of the stuff I'm working on. It's a lot. One of the nice things, it's a lot of greenfield stuff, building new components, but it also involves that kind of brownfield work of digging into that monolith. I've written more Ruby code in the last few months than I've written like in my entire career, and like going in and pulling those things apart. And it's really fun. It's really cool to just be part of that process of trying to build better reliability, and it kind of fits in with my patterns, which have been to build the core frameworks and the core components that help people get their work done. So I'm not building any of those fancy new features or like things, but like it's another one of those jobs where if we're doing our job right, nobody notices.
So that's really cool, and it will start to see the fruits of that. Like your next release will be next week, right? Like it'll be yeah.
Already things are already rolling out. One of the really cool things I learned about GitHub, and this is I think something to a lot of people who are building large production web apps, they'll be like, well, yeah, duh. But coming from a framework side, it was really cool. Like, one of the things we do at GitHub is we run these like science experiments where it's not quite A/B testing, but it's like, we're going to refactor this code path. Okay, well, let's wrap it in this thing that will run the old code path and the new code path and compare the results and ignore the new code for now, like ignore the results of the new code so that we don't break production. But we can roll out these refactorings that let us see things working in production. It's the testing and production kind of idea. We're seeing it working in production. If it fails, users aren't aware. It's just data that shows up in our thing saying, oh yeah, these mismatched results, these inputs produce different outputs. And like that, like a lot of those, because GitHub is a very mature service, like we have a lot of
I just want to understand that a little bit better, Andrew. You're actually saying that you're running the code side by side, but the users are actually using the old code. You run the new code as the experiment just to compare the outputs.
Yeah. So
that's
like
really cool.
There's actually it's a public open source library that GitHub wrote for Ruby called Scientist that basically it's exactly that pattern. You say here's the current code path, and you say here's one or more additional experiments I want to run, refactorings. I'm gonna, instead of doing it directly, I'm gonna call out to a service, or I'm gonna refactor it to use this new framework or whatever. And then it tells you things like, okay, it mismatched, the old code returned this, but the new code returned this, and you can go in and debug why it did that. Or the old code was this fast and the new code was way slower. I need to go in and fix that up a bit. And it gives you that layer of protection where, like I said, deployed 7 times, never caused an outage yet. First off, 7 times, not a lot of time to cause an outage yet, but all of those behind all these protections that meant that either I was deploying something behind these protections, or when I was taking the protections away, it was because we had seen it working at 100% accuracy for a good amount of time.
So you literally started in your career in the time of .NET hell, DLL hell, and you saw that be broken apart into components, and then you saw the services that support that broken down into microservices, and now you're working at an organization where tens of thousands, there's 100 million projects on GitHub. So 100 million projects are broken into small pieces, and you're trying to keep that running at scale. What are you excited about then in the next 10 years? Like you've come along, you've seen a lot of change in the last 10 years. Will you still have a job in 10 years, or are we just turning that over to AI?
Well, please predict the future for us. And if you can, pay extra attention to what stocks I should invest in.
Yes.
Right.
No, for real though. What's exciting?
Obviously, buy Microsoft. I'm really excited about seeing how microservices are playing out throughout the industry, and containerization, because I think that it's kind of one of those things is now everyone knows about it. It's not new, but we are starting to hit that point where people are starting to get really build really mature understandings of it, right? And saying that microservices. We've seen a number of these cases where people take their big monoliths, they break it apart into thousands of microservices, and then go wait a second, that was too far, and trying to find that nuance, that middle ground that's really balanced. I think that's really interesting. I'm really excited to keep working on these services. I think one of the coolest services out there right now that is really pushing some boundaries is the code spaces stuff. That's a really interesting idea to me. This idea of taking away the need to have a really powerful developer machine, and the power that can give you once you're running your development environment in the cloud. There's all kinds of things that open up. We've got live share. We've got the ability to I can run my code and say, hey, can you hit this endpoint, log in with your credentials so that I can figure out what's going on. It opens up the abilities to could you use something like code spaces to actually do debugging in or near production or things like that, right? You have this power that is totally new, right? Because you've got this code spaces environment in the cloud.
And I mean, that was completely unscripted, and you did not know this, but you did the perfect segue to our next guest, who will be Nick Mulnar. So that is that's perfect.
Yeah, Nick and I worked together a little bit with Glimpse and Asp.Net, and the work they've done on code spaces is really cool. And it's just being able to do that. We can I talked about this GitHub being this big Rails monolith. Well, we can run it in a code space, and that's huge, right? It took some work. It's taking work to get that figured out, but being able to be okay, we can put this code up in a code space, and I can use my iPad and make a change and run GitHub locally on my iPad, right? That's really cool. I'm obviously not. I'm using a server, but it was really cool. It's really powerful.
All right. So I think my takeaway from that is that you're going to be porting all of GitHub over to Apple's new processors so that it can run entirely on iPads. So that's the official word, ladies and gentlemen, from GitHub.
I do not speak for the company at all in any capacity.
These are my own.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. We really appreciate your insights into this, and it's super exciting to be able to talk to somebody who was kind of there through all this stuff. We were there on the outside, but it's really nice to be able to see kind of what was happening on the inside at the same time. And yeah, I look forward to hearing more about what you're going to do over the next 10 years, because the last 10 years have been super impressive.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to see what happens with .NET, especially over the next 10 years. Now, as a bit of an outsider myself, I've got those connections, but I watched .NET Conf and was I I know some of what was coming because of what was there, but I was like, I'm an outsider now. It's really fun. It's really exciting to sort of get that experience now of being able to watch it from the outside.
Super.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, and we'll see everybody on the next episode.